The global death toll from this pandemic is now over 7,500 and there are more than 190,000 cases. I'm going to bring you up to date on the situation in a number of countries over the next few minutes. These are some of the most recent pictures to come in. This is from Barcelona, where people have been out on their balconies playing instruments, sometimes alongside each other. You can see a young guy there playing the saxophone. This is inside a rest home in Japan, where people have been exercising indoors because they're not allowed to go outside. And remember, the virus is particularly deadly for elderly people. And remember, Japan has the most elderly population in the world, so particular care is being taken. These people are exercising outside on their rooftops in Rome, doing it in part in coordination with other neighbours across the way. You can see most of them still staying a little distance apart. Not so active in Venice, but these police are out on the streets to make sure quarantine regulations are being observed. Bear in mind, across Italy, people can only leave their homes if they have an urgent work reason or they need to get some food. And we're going to focus a little more on Italy now, because more than 2,500 people have died there and there are over 30,000 cases. It's the worst affected country aside from China. And as we've been discussing over the last month, the north of Italy is really the centre of this outbreak. Well, the New York Times The Daily podcast has spoken to a doctor in Bergamo. This is Professor Fabiano Di Marco. He's head of a respiratory unit there. He says doctors are making life and death decisions. They're admitting up to 70 critically ill patients a day, and that some patients are dying alone because the staff are overwhelmed. Inevitably, some of those staff are also becoming ill. Here's more of what he told the New York Times.
If I allow one or two relatives to come to the hospital, I have to give them these, but we do not have this for us.
Right, you need them for doctors.
Yeah. They cannot receive the relative in hospital. So the patients are alone and they die alone.
Well, this evening, EU leaders, including Italy's Prime Minister, have agreed to close Europe's borders for 30 days. They are establishing some fast-track lanes to allow goods to come between countries. Even so, this is just an additional measure on top of strident restrictions already. Bear in mind, Italy has been under a complete lockdown for close to a week now. Sima Katechas in Rome.
A display of resilience and solidarity. Locals in Rome feeling optimistic about what lies ahead as the country tackles the worst health crisis in a generation.
How do you feel the government is doing?
Sorry?
The Prime Minister, do you agree with what is happening?
Yes, I do.
Why?
Because it's the right thing to do, I think.
I never see Rome in this situation.
Popular streets empty, no tourists, nothing open. Orlando is a taxi driver. He tells us the soul has been ripped out of Italy.
I am not busy because there aren't people. Only to the hospital, some tourists, but very, very down.
The country has enforced rules preventing people from moving around. Stay indoors, especially if you're older, they're told. But some are choosing to rebel.
The advice for people who are older is to stay indoors?
Yes, we know. No, because we think we have to walk a little bit. Every 2 days we take a walk.
Well, let's hear a little more about how daily life has changed in Rome. Here's another resident of the city.
We feel a bit more lonely. We feel a little bit more segregated. We feel a little more bored than we used to. So I think we kind of changed our daily life, and I really hope that will help us to understand that maybe we needed to slow down a little bit.
Well, from Europe to the US, there are now nearly 6,000 cases there, and the death toll has reached 100. This map's been released by the primary US government body on this issue, the CDC, and it shows us that there's only one state, West Virginia, which has no reported cases. And also the CDC continues to push messages that are now very familiar. It says avoid close contact with people who are sick, wash your hands often, avoid touching your face, nose and eyes. And while the CDC plays its role in this health emergency, Today, Donald Trump turned to the strain on the US economy, just as Boris Johnson did here in the UK. And President Trump unveiled a raft of measures, including payments to small businesses, loan guarantees, and deferred personal tax payments. Here's a little of the statement from earlier.
We want to go big, go solid. The country is very strong. We've never been so strong, and that's what we're going to be doing. We don't want, with this invisible enemy, we don't want airlines going out of business. We don't want people losing their jobs or not having money to live when they were doing very well just 4 weeks ago. So we're going big, and that's the way it'll be, and that's the way everybody seems to like it on the Hill.
Well, let's bring in Gary O'Donoghue, who's live with us from the US. Gary, the president's saying everyone likes it this way on the Hill. Is that true? Has it got bipartisan support?
Well, the tone has changed on the Hill. There's no question about that, Ros. There's much more sort of bipartisan talk going on up there. They're not yelling at one another, frankly, as they normally are. And what's going to happen is that there's a bill going through at the moment that's worth a sort of $100 billion in help. But there's a much bigger one being talked about. And Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader up there, he set up a group of task forces to look at different areas of the economy, like individuals on the one hand, the airline industry on the other, small business on the other. They're going to draw something up and then try and knock out a deal with their Democratic counterparts. By the time all this has piled up, you could be looking at somewhere in the region of $1 trillion, $1,000 billion bailout situation.
And Gary, just quickly before we go on to another issue, I think a lot of people are wondering how quickly can this be turned round? How quickly can money actually reach people?
Well, the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, today says he wants checks, literally checks, to go out to Americans within the next 2 weeks. Now, that won't be all Americans. He doesn't want to give them to millionaires, as people will argue is pretty fair. But it might be people on maybe $75,000 or less, or $100,000 or less. And you're looking at a handout of maybe $1,000. All this detail is to be hammered out. And that seems to be the preferred system of help that the Trump administration wants to use, rather than doing anything with payroll taxes, which you wouldn't see for months and months and months.
So, Gary, that's the first story I want to ask you about. Here's the second, because there is now increasing tension between China and the US in the middle of this crisis. Today, Beijing announced that all US journalists working for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post are going to be expelled. They've got just 10 days to leave. And this looks like a direct response to this tweet yesterday from Donald Trump, in which he referred to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. Now, of course, it isn't a Chinese virus. It's a virus that started in China. And the president will surely have expected a response. Bear in mind, back in February, China expelled 3 journalists from the Wall Street Journal in connection with this article with the headline, "China is the real sick man of Asia." Beijing said that was racist, and so it took action. And Gary, to bring you back in here, there may be people watching who would be thinking, like the Democrats and the Republicans, maybe China and the US could put its differences aside, but it doesn't seem like it.
No, I think there's a certain amount of face that has to be saved in these circumstances. Tit for tat, diplomatically, can very much look like the playground, quite frankly. And that's what's been happening. We've had that editorial that the Chinese objected to, and in response to kicking out the Wall Street Journal journalists, the administration here sort of reclassified some Chinese news organizations. Now you've had these comments from the president. He's actually said more than once calling it the Chinese virus, and now these moves by Beijing. So yeah, they're going at it, frankly, like a couple of people after a Friday night out.
And just quickly, Gary, before I let you go, what's it like in DC?
It's very quiet. We don't have a sort of curfew in place here, but the streets are pretty empty. People are shopping, as you can imagine, for stuff pretty rapidly. The shelves have emptied out in the local store, certainly on one occasion. And I was noticing downstairs just a moment ago, the Wi-Fi is getting a bit ropey, so I think that working from home thing may be having an impact.
OK, Gary, thank you very much indeed. Well, we've been talking about China. Let's bring you up to date with what's happening there. After all, this is where the virus began. There have now been over 3,200 deaths there and over 80,000 confirmed cases. Now, bear in mind, the new infection rate in China has fallen close to zero because of very strict restrictions which are in place. But it remains unclear what's going to happen if and when those restrictions are lifted. Well, speaking of tough restrictions, they are also coming into place, not in Ukraine, where there have been seven cases and 1 death, I know, but I wanted to, actually, no, I was hoping to show you a map of France, but that's not going to come up. Where are we going? Sometimes the map takes on a life of its own, apologies. Now, I wanted to focus on France because people have to stay at home and can only go out for essential duties. This was announced by Emmanuel Macron last night, but it's come into place today. These restrictions will be in place for at least 15 days, and these are pictures from Paris today. An extra 3,000 police officers have been deployed in Paris to check that people are complying with these restrictions. Frankly, Emmanuel Macron was unimpressed over the weekend by the way that people were not following advice, and so France is getting stricter. Nearly 150 people have died in France, over 7,000 confirmed cases. Here's more from Hugh Schofield in Paris.
This is the form which everyone is going to have to get very, very used to. It's a form which you print from the Ministry of Interior, and it's the form you have to have with you when you go out from your house or your home as of midday today. It's what they call in French an attestation sur honneur. It's to say, I hereby attest that I'm doing this, that or the other. And there are 5 boxes you can tick. 5 categories of movement which are allowed for work, for health, for imperative family reasons, to go shopping, or for a brief excursion just to go jogging or to walk the dog.
Now, it is 2 months to the day since the BBC's Stephen McDonnell filed our first report on what was then a mysterious new illness which had killed 2 people in the city of Wuhan in China. Here's how we covered the story 2 months back.
Chinese officials have been reassuring the public that the virus cluster which has caused pneumonia in Wuhan is under control. There have been deaths, but the authorities say only dozens of people have been infected. However, scientists in Britain have estimated that the true number of cases could already be at least 1,700.
And surely none of us could have imagined where we would be 2 months later. Here's Stephen again talking earlier as we look at some of the most recent pictures from China.
Look, in one way, it's kind of a bit frightening that we went from nothing to this sort of global emergency so quickly. But, you know, in a funny way, you could also see this as kind of positive. I mean, assuming that the Chinese figures are not drastically wrong, I think other countries can look to China and see that there is a way out. You will get to where China is now. I mean, we went from then up to 80,000 plus people being infected, down to now currently less than 10,000 infections, and according to official figures, only 1 extra homegrown infection in all of China today, and that's in the city of Wuhan. The other infections have come in the form of people travelling from overseas, and this is why there's been a lot of emphasis on this, and why Chinese cities have now introduced these quite strict quarantine procedures when you arrive in Beijing, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, because the authorities there are worried that people returning from Europe, from North America into China, believing that it's sort of safe here, could reinfect everyone.